when you started with the Forest Service, perhaps even where you were born and raised, to show your connection with the West Kootenays.
Yeah. Well, I was born in Nelson, raised here, went to Creston in 1941, finished school there, and started with the Forest Service in Creston in a summertime position called dispatcher for 3 summers. Then wrote and passed the assistant ranger examination and became an assistant ranger in 1946, I guess it was. And I worked out of Boswell. That was my headquarters for that summer. In the fall, I went back to Creston, and in January 47, went to the second class of the Forest Service Ranger School at Green Timbers. Summer of 47, I spent working at Nelson Ranger District Headquarters here, I guess, in charge of the fire suppression crews that they had. One at Lumberton, one at Erie or Salmo, I think, yeah. And in the fall of 40... Where did I go after? Yeah, back to Ranger School for the fall of 47, and in January of 48, I was back in Creston. So, I guess maybe it was 48 I was in charge of the suppression crews, not 47. 48 I was in charge of the suppression crews. And then I filled in the Nelson Ranger District. George Palethorpe, who was Ranger in Nelson, had his leg broken, so for 3 months or so I looked after the Nelson Ranger District. What happened then? And I went over to Kettle Valley for 3 months too to help out there. And then back to Lardeau in January of 49. No, pardon me, went back to Lardeau in April of 49, and that's the first year it was open as a ranger district of its own. Mm-hmm. So,
were you the first ranger in the Lardeau?
First ranger stationed in the Lardeau, as near as I know, yeah. So CPR boats ran twice a week. Occasionally the Amabilis, or the landing craft, came up from Kaslo. They were stationed at Kaslo, brought a vehicle up and a few other things like that. Other than that, our transportation on Kootenai Lake was an 18-foot Peterborough canoe with a 5-horsepower motor. And we had 2 assistant rangers that year in Lardeau, 2 patrolmen in the Duncan. We called them the Upper Duncan and Lower Duncan patrolmen, but they worked together. Spent a lot of time at the old Haley's landing cabin, and 2 lookout men, one on what we called Duncan Lookout on Bear Mountain, and the other was Lavina Lookout. So that was, and a dispatcher, that was the size of the staff. So we had only the one fire of any consequence that year, and that was the one I mentioned before at the West Fork of the Duncan. We had radio on the lookouts in those days. I think they probably put radios in about 1938 on Lavina anyhow. Prior to that, it was all telephone lines. There was no telephone line to Duncan Lookout because it was established a few years later after radios came into effect. But we looked after 3 or at least there were 3 telephone lines looked after for quite a few years up in the Lardeau. The telephone line from Lardeau to Girard, and I think that must have been taken over from the railroad after the railroad was pulled out and they used the railroad grade as a road. The CPR, of course, didn't look after the line, but the Forest did. And I think altogether there was something like 20 telephones on that line. Then we had another line that went from Lardeau around to Johnson's Landing, and another line that was pretty well shot by the time I got there, went up the Duncan River, and we could still see traces of it along by Hauser Creek, but probably at one time it may have gone through to Haley's Landing, but that would have been long before my time. I don't really remember too much of that. But the radio communication we had was big and heavy and awkward. And it was all basically AM, so it tended to be pretty noisy at times. And especially the frequency we were using in those days in the Nelson region. It was 2848 kilocycles or something on an AM band.
Did you have to maintain the phone line then?
Oh yes, yeah, we maintained the phone line right through to Girard, and I don't think we kept it up to Johnson's Landing. I can't remember spending any time or effort there, but we did keep the other line open to Argenta anyhow. Mm-hmm. So we had some communication there. And then I think the old CPR telephone line between Kaslo and Lardeau, which used to run along the lakeshore, I think was in 49 that we managed to get a telephone hooked onto that, and it hooked into the BC Telephone Exchange in Kaslo. So we had for the last 2 or 3 months I was there anyhow, we had telephone communication through BC Tel. Mm. They're all magnetophones, so of course you wound them up. And telephone number was 88R, as I recall. It was a party line. So other than that, we were pretty much on our own. We had three river boats that were 34-foot boats that were based in Hauser. And had big old Johnson outboard motors on them, which were 2-cylinder opposed to 22 horsepower. You couldn't make it from Hauser to Haley's Landing without stopping and filling the fuel tank once or twice, depend on the going, on the way up, which meant that you found a place to tie the boat up while you filled up, and then you sort of pushed the boat out into the river and hoped the motor would start in a few pulls of the starter cord. There were no rewind starters on those either. You wrapped the cord around the flywheel and pulled and hoped it would go.
Did it always start?
I can only remember once when one of those motors started the first pull, but they usually started after 3 or 4 pulls anyhow. But they were a great boat. They were certainly well built and worked well in the rivers.
Mm-hmm. Who actually ran the boats on the river?
The patrolman, or the assistant ranger, whoever was. See, the Lower Duncan patrol, supposedly it was one man, one boat, and but like I said, the 2 patrolmen worked together, and they either stayed at Hauser or at Haley's Landing, depending on what work they were doing or what the hazard might have been at the time and so on.
What was their job?
Well, they're primarily looking after the river. It needed a lot of work on it, snags, deadheads, and that sort of thing to be cleaned out. And they did a little bit of trail work. They had to make sure that the trail, or keep the trail open to bear lookout, and they were the people who used to carry groceries, pack groceries up to the lookout man, or at least they'd pack them part way up and the lookout man would meet them and take them the rest of the way. Mm-hmm. Other than that, their main job would have been firefighting.
Well, what would happen if there was a fire?
Well, we recruited manpower too, but their basic job, as I say, was a patrol job too. But if there were fires, they were involved in those. In a supervisory role as much as anything if the fire required outside help. But like I say, it was a relatively wet year, that 49, so they didn't, outside of that one fire in the West Fork, the Duncan, they backpacked their initial stuff in, and then extra supplies were airdropped to them from the old Junkers aircraft that was stationed at the regional headquarters here in Nelson. That was the aircraft that did the patrols after lightning storms and the airdrops of supplies to remote fires. They got to be pretty good at that, packing parachutes, and it took a long time to learn how to properly package stuff for airdrops, but up till that time, some of the early aircraft we had, there was no way you could airdrop anything from them. The Junkers was the first of the aircraft that we had in the region that was a good aircraft for that sort of thing.
And they were on floats? On
floats, yeah. You know, all of our aircraft were on floats for, oh goodness me, I can't... well into the 60s, mid-60s, maybe late 60s, we went from the Junkers into a series of Beaver aircraft after that. They were all float equipped. And then, of course, there were more and more airstrips developed in places like Revelstoke and Kaslo, Creston, where else? Over in, there were airports at Grand Forks, eventually an airport developed at Beaverdale, and along the Arrow Lakes there were in the cusp and so on. Then, of course, they switched to small twin-engine aircraft with wheels, and by then, of course, the helicopter had become a pretty available tool, so you did away with the airdropping of supplies, because the helicopter could sling stuff in on long rope if he had to and put it right where it was needed. Mm-hmm. So some of the first helicopter use on fires was in the 60s. Or probably late 50s. 57, 58, G1s and G2s and Hiller 12Es, they were the basic machines of the day, mm-hmm. limited to the loads they could carry, elevations they could work, and so on. And quite a few years later, before the light turbine-powered helicopters came on.
Mm-hmm. You must have had to develop your procedures as you went along, if they were new, and it was find new ways to use them.
Yeah, well, originally the aircraft we used, I can remember when I was a kid seeing the old Moth here at Nelson. It was a float plane, did patrol work and so on. We had no radio communication in those days, so I don't know how they got messages around anyhow. But after the war, the first aircraft that we had in Nelson as sort of a contract aircraft was a Cessna Crane. It was a twin-engine training plane, I guess, that they used with the Empire Air Training Scheme or whatever it was. Anyhow, I said, well, twin-engine aircraft, was pretty nice. Well, there was a safety factor. It could fly on one engine. So we were up flying around one day, and I was sitting in the co-pilot seat, I guess, the seat beside the pilot. Now, here's a little brass tag right on the instrument panel of the aircraft. It says, maximum elevation that this aircraft can above sea level that this aircraft can maintain is something like 865 feet or something. So here we are with this great safety factor of a twin-engined aircraft flying at 1,700 feet basic sea level, so it wasn't going to make it anyhow. Then, of course, we got the Junkers, which was a great plane, and its wings literally flapped, and I can remember the pilot we had was a fairly young fellow named Chuck Wilson, and he was concerned about all this movement in the wings on the aircraft when we were flying, and he got in touch with his boss, or chief pilot of the company, and he was sort of told, well, don't worry about that. He said, time to start worrying is when they don't flap. So, that's the sort of thing. And then we thought we were well off when the Beaver came along, and we were compared to the types of aircraft that we'd had previously. So it was with the Junkers that started some of the airdrop stuff, and it was continued with the Beaver over the years. And then, of course, helicopters came along.
What were you airdropping primarily?
Grub to fires. Mm-hmm. Or if we had, occasionally we'd have cruising crews, way out in the boondocks. We're going to be there for 10 days while, they'd drop some of the grub to them, and they just pack some of their essential gear and so on with them, and then airdrop their grub.
Did they always get their grub?
Oh yeah, mostly we had the odd time when chutes didn't open, but in later years it seldom, if ever, happened. Some of the places where we dropped to fires, of course, stuff got hung up in tall trees. Now, if you ended up with a cruising crew, they would probably pick a campsite that was, where they could drop the stuff, and they wouldn't have any problem retrieving it. But those guys got pretty accurate with what they were doing. So then, like you say, the helicopters came along, and there were sure lots of limitations with the early ones. A lot of the early ones, it wasn't sling stuff, it was, rack loads of things, so they had to have a place they could more or less sit down. Later on, of course, when they had the hooks on them and they could use long lines and so on, it made a lot of difference. And then, of course, even later than that, some of the long lines, they took their line back with them because they had a hook that was controlled electrically from in there that went down the line, and the hook opened at the bottom, whereas before they sort of dropped right from the aircraft. It was line and hook and the whole works, went. But and there've been a lot of innovative things done with helicopters, pretty good machine. They're getting better all the time. For fire, of course, the business of rappelling, while the helicopter hovers and the lads go down the rope with their sky genies, that made a big difference in that sort of thing. But I don't think they have an aircraft. For years, we always had an aircraft attached to the regional office here, a twin-engine aircraft in later years on wheels, because there were enough airstrips around. And it used to do a lot of the patrol work as well as provide transportation around the region for people who, if you got a high-priced man, you can't afford to have him driving for 2 days in order to attend a half-day meeting or something along that line. So usually they would fly, and they'd always find something else for the aircraft to do while they were waiting. They get to a district, and the district might have something to do. So, because the aircraft was under contract, it probably cost a little bit less than hiring a local aircraft anyhow. And besides that, it was pretty well dolled out with radio equipment, communications equipment that fit into our networks and so on. So, and then of course the air tanker thing came along. I guess the earliest air tankers we had were the old Grumman Avengers. We did have some float aircraft, of course, that had some of the earlier Beaver that were honest to God water scoopers, and they had tanks on the floats, and they'd pick stuff up in 1960. 57, 58, can't remember. No, 67, 60. I'm not sure. Can't remember when that fire was across the lake from Campbell Creek. Yeah, it was Campbell Creek fire. We had a Fairchild Husky, which looked like a dragonfly sort of thing, and it had an interior tank on it, and scooped up into an interior 150-gallon tank, and he let it out the tail end. Must have been 57 that the Campbell Creek fire was across from Kaslo. So that was a sort of one-of-a-kind aircraft. That we had Steermen, which were on wheels that had 75-gallon retardant tank on them. But the Avengers were the old torpedo bomber, and they failed to build for a long time. They're pretty well all gone now. And then they had the A-26s, which were a twin-engined United States Air Force bomber. I don't know whether Conair has any of those. Now, of course, the Tracker, which is called the Firecat, is the more up-to-date machine, which is being used pretty much all over the province. It's still got some. Well, there's probably still the odd Kaslo kicking around that's equipped for water bombing. That's again, it could probably haul retardant, but I think since it's a flying boat hull, it probably is still scooping water, maybe down the coast or something. And then, of course, one that the BC Forest Service has never been very pleased with, even though the federal government offered all sorts of incentives for provinces to get them, are the Canadair CL-215. Mm-hmm. And that's, again, is a straight water thing. They work good on short turnaround, but if you have to fly, and this is why they probably work so well in Quebec and Ontario, because there's so many lakes and they can just literally go around in a circle. But when you're flying half to 3/4 of an hour, maybe before you drop stuff, it's not that good. The retardants that Forest Service here has been using are all long-term retardants and so on. So I guess that's where it stands at the present time. When I retired, we think we still had, maybe there was one Firecat or something. A-26s were still around when I retired. There may be some, but I think it's primarily Firecats. And well, in this region, I know it's Firecats now. And DC-6 was the other, of course, one that has turned out to be a roaring success.
That's a big plane to turn in a little valley, though.
Yeah.
They have some side creeks.
Yeah, I guess the pilots know what they're doing nowadays. They had accidents in the past, and haven't heard of any in the last few years with the DC-6s. But I don't know whether it was a case of losing power or something, and the pilot figured he could get over the hill and he didn't quite make it. Whereas probably if he'd dumped his load, he might have made it. I don't know. You can speculate about aircraft accidents like all you want, I guess. But it's really they've really been quite helpful. That, along with the ability to get initial attack crews there by helicopter, either using the repel system or just able to put initial attack crews down somewhere and let them walk for 10-15 minutes to a fire. And if you can use the air tankers just to buy you that much time, it's pretty good. Expensive, but who's to say? But no, I think if you can get the detection, the worst part now, I guess, is the man-caused fires. The lightning location system should give people, if they look at the information that's available and comes out of it, get some air patrols out, it should give them a good idea where their problem spots are, because you know where the lightning has been. Mm-hmm. anyhow, where years ago you didn't. All you knew there was a flash in the sky, and you're not quite sure how many ridges over it was. Now it's plotted, well, it's amazing accuracy in that system. It's available in every district now, whereas previously it used to be available only in the region. The region had to try and get information out to district. Now every district can access it. So that, and if you use the information there, and if you use the weather forecasts and the indices, you should have some idea of what you might or should do. But it's come a long way in 10 years, believe me. Again, it's communications, it's all the things that electronics can do for people now. And of course, the weather system, which we were just barely got started on when I was there, is now all interrogated automatically at specific times, and goes into the fire weather indices and so on, but can be interrogated at any time you want. So these automated weather stations are doing their thing, and that data is accessible. Initially you used to get people to read them once or twice a day. They had a memory on them. I guess maybe it was probably once a day they'd read them and get yesterday's data out of them, but now they can get it any time somebody wants to sit down at the computer and ask for it. So that's another communications network that has been established to tie all these weather stations together. So they've got a lot of good tools available now.
And is less acreage lost now than before?
I really have no idea. I haven't looked at any statistics since 1983, so I couldn't.
Since the 40s. Just as a generalization.
There have been some fires that have been much more severe than there were in the 40s, primarily, I guess, because of some of the areas that were burned had been logged, and they weren't. But in the 40s, and maybe it's primarily because of the fuel that was on the ground. In general, I would say, over in one specific year, you might find a situation that's been bad. But I think in general terms, if you look at it over a period of time, I think it's much improved. I think that we probably are, getting back to think I work for them yet, I think they probably find that there's probably in some instances, some places, a little higher incidence of man-caused fire than there used to be.
Do you remember the one at Duncan Lake at Hauser that opened up after the war? It must have been there.
It burned when I was there on a Saturday night. Yeah, that was Duncan Lake Lumber Company, they called it, yeah.
Was that a typical sized mill?
Yeah, it was a steam mill, and that was about it. They were logging on the Hauser Creek, I guess, on the flats there at Hauser Creek, and floating it down the river to the head of the lake, and then they had a little old, I think George Sozik was doing the logging for them, and they had a little cat up in there. And I can't remember whether there was anything much trucked from other places, but I know that they had to blast some of the logs in two because they were just too big for the head saw.
To blast them?
Yeah, they used a little bit of powder to split them in two. And of course, that would be the cedar butts. They were probably hollow anyhow, but a lot of good, clear cedar came out of that. And they trucked their lumber to Lardeau and loaded it in boxcars there. There was another mill, I think, at that particular time up on Hauser Ridge, too. Bedwell, I think, ran it. Little mill up there. Mm. There was very little, actually. The summer I was there, there was some pole cutting going on, and other than that, there was not much in the way of timber work. Mm. Kootenai Forest Products hadn't been, let's see, they'd be Glacier Lumber Company in those days. I guess they weren't up there in the early days. It's years later that they went up.
They were logging on the main lake first, were they?
Yeah, they were Crawford Creek and so on. They were some of the earlier places that they logged. Crawford Creek, Goat Creek. You know, these are all sort of south of Crawford Bay. These were areas that they logged, and then they had their tugboats. I think a few years later they started up in the Duncan. When I was in Kaslo, I can't remember whether they had camp and so on up in, maybe they did. Maybe they were all, didn't go up to the Lardeau very much because I had enough with Crawford Bay and so on as part of the Kaslo district when I was there. Uh-huh. But they could have been up in maybe they were set up at Marblehead in the mid-50s.
George McInnes logged in the Duncan, didn't he?
Yeah. I think he had a mill up there, so probably at Hauser, probably bottom of Duncan Lake. He probably had a mill in there at some time. That was long before my time. I think there were a couple of mills burned in there over the years. Mm-hmm.
As forest rangers, were you conscious of the changing forest, of the changing kinds of species as white pine was logged out, that the forest coming after it was different? And were there attempts to ensure regeneration of certain species?
Oh, well, again, like I said, everything was selectively cut, and quite likely on some of the white pine as an example, perhaps the cutting diameter would be a little bit higher than it would be on the fir and so on. I don't think it really presented much of a problem to us in those days. To start with, the areas that were being logged are nothing like the size that are being logged today.
How long were you at Lardeau?
Just for the summer of. I left there in November of 49 and was transferred to Kettle Valley. Mm-hmm. So I was in Kettle Valley from late 49 until 55, January 55, and then I moved back to Kaslo as ranger in Kaslo. It was Kaslo from 55 to 62 when I moved into here as supervisor.
What was your job for after you became a ranger? Were you in protection?
Well, protection was part of the thing, and depended what district you're in. There was three basic things that were involved for the forest ranger. That was forest protection, forest management, and range management. Mm. So if you happened to be in a district where there was a fair amount of, or fairly decent sized cattle industry and so on, you spent a lot of time in range management, allocation of crown range for summer grazing for cattle and so on. It was probably one of the bigger headaches in the job. And other than that, there were the usual forest protection things, the fire prevention part of it, and detection. And then timber management, of course, was timber cruising, timber sales, inspections of cutting and that sort of thing. Hmm. Trespasses, seizures, whatever. But all of the, when fires were going, all of the staff were involved in them. And we didn't have people who were specifically there for for fires, except those that were hired as fire suppression crews, and they're usually high school students set in a camp, and they were probably only 2 months, probably July and August was the term that they were available. And they were primarily an initial attack fire crews, so they would get out and get the fire tied up, and if it was, if there's going to be a week or two, 10 days or whatever after that, where people are going to have to babysit it, we would hire people to look after it and get the initial attack crew, the fire suppression crew, back to camp and cleaned up and organized, tools conditioned for the next go.
So you were working at the district office then after Kettle Valley?
Kettle Valley.
Or after Kaslo?
At Kaslo, yeah. I transferred into the regional office as a supervisor of rangers. Mm-hmm. So there were 3 in the Nelson region at that time. We had 22 rangers, and there were 3 ranger supervisors. So over a period of years until the reorganization of the Forest Service occurred, I guess, in 79, 80. I think all the supervisors had covered the whole of the 22 districts in the region. Every 2 or 3 years we used to change the districts we supervised.
And did you do that until you retired?
No, and when the Forest Service organization took place, the Ranger Supervisor's job became one of the redundant positions in the organization, and so I took over a regional protection job in Nelson until I retired in 84.
Mm-hmm. Had you wanted to be a forest ranger? Is that something you thought about deliberately?
Well, I guess I became a dispatcher when I was still in high school, and it was one of these things where the ranger came around to the schools and was looking for people who wanted a summer job, and there were a number of us. He interviewed us, and I was chosen. So after 3 summers as a dispatcher, while I was going to school, I wrote the assistant ranger examination when I had a chance to, and passed that exam, and went on from there. But this is basically, in those days, how a lot of people got started in the Forest Service. They either were a patrolman or a dispatcher or working seasonally, and took the opportunity to write the assistant ranger examinations when they came around in the winter, and managed to snag a vacant position somewhere. Mm-hmm. A fair number of the assistant rangers in the early days, of course, were laid off every end of September, and weren't put on till the middle of April or 1st of May the following year. That was in the years immediately after the end of the Second War. By 1950, I think that most assistant rangers were employed year-round. They may have got shuffled around from one district to the other. They may have been in one district during the summer and then shoved off to some other district for the winter, just based on the sorts of workloads as they occurred. So, it was a good experience. Other districts, for instance, the districts on the Columbia River, primarily, say Golden and Revelstoke, they had a fair number of patrolmen and river boats, and because the Columbia River really wasn't navigable around the whole length of the Big Bend, of course they had several boathouses along the river where they kept river boats, and the old Big Bend Highway was quite a trial. I think it used to take all day long to drive from Golden to Revelstoke or vice versa. So on the Golden side, there was there was a assistant ranger station or patrol station at Bush River, and then at 100 Mile on the Big Bend, there was another fairly good-sized station operated out of Revelstoke. And then along the river in various places they had single boats, river. They were basically 34-foot riverboat style boats and boathouses. So, and nobody ever bothered them in those days. Really, they were, you know, if you always went to the boathouse, you were going to find your gasoline and your boat and motor still intact. It wasn't going to have disappeared on you while you were away.
What was it like to go to Green Timbers?
It was a change. You know, you met people from all over the province there. The time I went, of course, the classes were half rangers and half assistant rangers. So you had the benefit of some real old timers along with a bunch of new young fellows too. And the sort of camp that I suppose by today's standards would be, people would be looking down their nose at it, but there was sure nothing wrong with it in those days. The first session we were there, the 5-man bunkhouses we were in, there was no lining in them or anything like that. They were just a cabin with some electric lights in them. You went to a washroom where they had the wash basins and the showers and the toilets. That building was set in between, right in the middle of the 4 bunkhouses, so it wasn't very far for anybody to travel. And of course you didn't have any snow, so in the winter. So that was a little different for some of us, a winter with no snow.
Was that the first time you'd been out of the area?
Yeah, it's the first time I'd been to the coast. You know, in the early days traveling here, the highways weren't much good. It was a good over 24 hours by train. You know, and a lot of people just didn't do that much traveling in those days. Bus service was kind of erratic. So that was the first time I was down the coast in my life. You know.
Now, when did Rangers school start? It was in the
46. First classes went there in 46. I was in the second class in 47.
Did you go down after Labor Day in September?
Yeah, it was. It was closer to the end of September. Yeah.
You had to write an exam to be accepted?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's one of these things where you didn't know what the examination was going to be about and so on. And I guess some of us who were a little bit younger and were not too long out of high school didn't have much problem because it turned out to be primarily a mathematics examination. So.
And did you finish in one season, or did you have to go back a
second? No, in those days there was 2 terms from January to the end of March, and from sometime in September to just before Christmas. And you had to write examinations, of course, all the way through this thing. So you had to pass those examinations before you got put on any sort of a list for promotion. The early days, you know, they didn't advertise positions. People were just sort of appointed to them. As time went on, of course, and as the organization grew and as communication got better, that is, you know, not only from the point of view of electronically, but highways and so on, airlines and so on, you know, you could probably draw from a larger pool of people, so that's when they started advertising. Mm-hmm. And people weren't afraid to move around a little bit in those days. But there were, for a lot of years, nobody ever got out of the interior into what we called the Vancouver district. That was just a preserve where you started in the Vancouver district, you stayed in the Vancouver district. It's just one of those things. Of course, dealing with different timber types and all sorts of different things there. So it's quite a few years before any of the fellows from the interior ended up in Vancouver district. And then, of course, once they went to advertising, there was a lot of changing around of people going from region to region and so on. They were called districts in the early days. Now they're regions. So.
You started your career just about the time the Sloan Commission report came out. Is that right? Which made some real changes in the forest.
Yeah, the first Sloan Commission report. I think I can remember the hearings being on. I think that report came out probably in early '48 or something like that. Did it not? Do you remember?
I wasn't thinking so much of the exact year, but just how perhaps whether that brought changes to.
I don't think it brought that many changes necessarily to the structure of the Forest Service. It probably, in time, brought a lot of changes in tenure and licensing and so on to harvest timber. I think the tree farm license came out of that first Sloan report. Mm-hmm. And I think that made a lot of difference, not so much in the interior, but certainly to the coast. I don't think at that particular time in the early 40s, I can really only remember about, don't know what there was in the East Kootenays at that time. There may have been one, but I do remember in my own ranger district there were 2 tree farm licenses issued, one to what was Boundary Sawmills and the other to Ollinger Lumber Company, I guess, or Don McLean Lumber Company, I guess it was called in those days in Beaverdale. They were the major, that seemed to be the major change in the type of tenure. And by being issued a tree farm license, of course, the industry accepted a fair number of responsibilities relative to forest protection, regeneration of the log sites and whatever.
Was there a seasons to the Rangers' work during the year? Did you do certain things at some times of year?
Yeah, the summer was pretty much the season for protection sorts of things. We used trail crews to cut the brush off of trails and that sort of thing during the summer. Yes, when we had our fires, that's when we had our suppression crews, and this is when we did a lot of our improvement work, even a lot of the range improvements like drift fencing and so on, which we did a lot of that sort of building on the Crown Ranges. Winter was primarily involved with timber work. We did a lot of our cruising in the early winter. Mm-hmm.
What was involved in timber cruising?
Well, basically it was tallying. It was basically sampling the timber stand. Now, in the early days, it was all strip cruising, where you took a strip, used a compass, ran a direction, and you cruised half a chain or something on each side of your tape and tallied the trees. That gave you, and you mapped the timber types as you went along. That gave you sort of a sample, which you could then work out the volumes and apply it to the area. You know, when you did your mapping, of course, you were mapping out the areas that were not satisfactorily restocked or where there was a change in timber types and that sort of thing. You arrived at values, and then you did an appraisal on it, in which you theoretically logged the stuff and moved it to a mill, and sawed it into lumber and sold the lumber, and on the basis of that, you arrived at a price that was going to be charged for the stumpage on the timber. So,
how large were these?
Well, some small sales might only be 20 acres, but in other places you could have had timber sales that went up to 1,700 acres, maybe even larger than that. A lot depended on the topography and how the access was going to be to them.
Who decided where the timber sales would be?
Well, the individual companies applied for a timber sale, and the first step was to take an application, and then it was submitted, and we got a clearance on it, and the clearance was nothing more than to say that it was Crown land, and there was no encroachment of private land or mineral claims or whatever over this sort of thing, and that then you had an idea of then where you were going to cruise. Sometimes, of course, you would end up cruising an area bigger than the cleared area, primarily because it was the logical thing to do. And then, of course, before you proceeded to do all your paperwork, you had to get an amended clearance to cover the extra area. In places like the Kettle, where there were so many mineral claims around Greenwood and other parts, a lot of these mineral claims had surface rights attached to them. They were surveyed long enough ago, so quite frequently timber sales in that particular thing had more funny little jogs and so on, because you ended up going around timber sales where the holder of going around mineral claims where the holder of the mineral claim actually had timber rights on that mineral claim too. So
you must have had to be, in a case like that, fairly exact.
Well, yeah, you spend a lot of time looking for old survey monuments, and we always, where we were involved, or mostly always where we were involved with mineral claims, we could get copies of the surveyor's old original field notes, so we may not be able to find an old wooden corner post, but occasionally you could find trees that had scars on them, and by chopping out the scar you'd find the bearing trees that the surveyor had put in, even though the post had rotted out many years ago. So it was all very time consuming occasionally. Now, there are other, I'm sure there are other areas that had a lot of mineral claims too, but there are other parts of the country where there wasn't a lot of mineral activity, and things were much more straightforward, Tended to end up with squares and rectangles and so on. Yeah.
Who laid out the roads?
In the early days, the person who was the licensee of the sale did their own road layouts. Occasionally, our maps would indicate a possible location for an access road, but basically the licensee was responsible for roads.
How did you assure that the timber sales were appropriate in terms of overall management of the ranger district, and the amount of timber, the age class, and all?
Well, in the interior, for one thing, the clear cut didn't exist. Slash burning didn't exist. The machines were all much smaller than they are today. The standard method of disposing of slash was lopping and scattering. The logging was all selective cutting. 32-foot log was probably the longest log that was skidded out of the bush. Tree length skidding in those days just didn't occur. The machines were small. A lot of smaller cats were used for skidding, and contract conditions required that the blade be taken off the cat when they were skidding, that trees were followed in herringbone fashion to the skid trails, and they were taken out that way. So you didn't have the compaction that you get with the rubber-tired machines, and you didn't get the amount of small stuff being knocked down, because you weren't skidding tree-length stuff, you were skidding already manufactured logs. Other parts of the country, they used jammer skidding, which was nothing more than an old truck chassis that had a couple of poles on it in the form of an A-frame and a winch, and some guy with lots of muscles sort of carried a set of tongs on a 3/8 or half-inch cable out into the bush and hooked them onto the log that the faller had left there, and were dragged in a log at a time. They also used those same machines, of course, for loading the trucks. So, it was in a lot of those stands, and because they were selectively cut, logs were manufactured in the bush. You didn't get a lot of other stuff knocked over. 14-inch diameter stump height was sort of, again, the standard. A tree had to be over that before it was cut. So, you left an area that had a reasonable amount of scarification with the small machines and the individual logs being dragged through the bush, and a pretty good seed source. I know a lot of those areas had second timber sale over them probably 15 years later.
Was that in some ways, though, in a sense, high grading the site and leaving poorer trees that took up the growing room? No.
There was nothing wrong with a lot of those smaller trees, except they were younger, and the standard in those days was a 14 inches diameter stump height, or breast height, as we used to say, which meant that it had even a little bit bigger stump than that. And that was the size of tree that was classed as merchantable in the early days. The type of sawmills that were around, you couldn't really handle a lot of 8-inch stuff like a lot of the pine that's being taken out now. Of course, some of it's pretty small, but the old mills all had circular saws, and the curve about 3/8 of an inch wide, on the saw teeth. So, and they just couldn't. They just wouldn't be able to handle a lot of the small stuff now with chip and saw and gang saws and the band saws they're using in the mills. They can handle that smaller stuff without losing too much in sawdust. And of course, they have the capability of in that size stuff of tree length logging. I'm sure you've seen load after load of jack pine on the highway that are all tree length and tops down to 3 and 4 inches. The standard top size in the early days, of course, was 8 inches. We didn't start charging them for waste unless their tops were over 8 inches in diameter.
So you would do the cruising and make all your calculations, and then would that be put up for bid, or would the company originally?
No, it was all put up for bid. All went to auction in the early days. Some of it went to auction. Some of it, I really can't remember why the difference. Some of it went to sealed tender, where sealed tenders were sent to the what we called the district forester in those days, would now be called a regional manager, and of course the highest bidder got it. But where there was a lot of competition, I can remember having auction sales and timber sales where we had 50 and 60 bids, maybe 4 or 5 sawmills bidding on the stuff. So our auctions were always held on Saturday mornings.
Well, what was the auction like? Was it an auction where you were standing in front and
No.
would bid out loud?
No, I sat at a desk and we had to record each bid, who it was by, and some of them would say 10 cents across the board. In other words, he was raising the upset price of the thing by 10 cents, 1,000 board feet for everything, or somebody might say 25 cents on the fir, or 5 cents on the pine. He always had to raise something. You couldn't go back on anything. The price that was bid previously, if it was one of these across the board things, that was the price. And then, of course, after the auction was over, the successful party then, of course, had to produce cash or a check or something for the additional amount of money for the 10% deposit, because he had a basic deposit there to start the bidding, but he also had to produce the extra money, the 10% of the extra value at the time of the auction. So that was a security deposit. Then, of course, as they harvested the stuff, they paid for it as it was harvested, and eventually, after the sale was finalized, as we'd say, everything was okay, then they would eventually get their security deposit back. There were a few changes made later on too. They could deposit, or at least deposit bonds, or for instance, in a bank, and the bank would give us an understanding that these bonds were there and were being held, so that they could get interest on their money that was tied up as a security deposit. Whereas I don't think we paid any interest on the money that was held as security deposits on these things at all. Those are the sorts of things in the 40s and 50s nobody seemed to worry much about. Not at our level anyhow. We didn't have any more money than it took to live.
Who would bid other than sawmills?
Well, nobody. I guess most of the bidders were sawmills. We had other things, not so much in the Kettle, but for instance in Kootenai Lake, where you might have had sales where the major product was probably cedar poles, and there might be a residual volume of saw logs of one sort or another. Then, of course, you'd probably get a totally different group of people involved, because, you know, in the early days, you were either in the pole business or you were in the saw log business, just an example. And then in other parts of the country where there was a lot of old cedar, dead cedar, there was a big market for cedar fence posts, you know. This could have been some of the areas that had been burned, and some of the big old cedar were killed and they stood there. And so then you had sales for cedar fence posts and that sort of thing. The railroad used to buy literally hundreds of thousands of fence posts in the early middle 40s, when the rights of way were all fenced. I guess most of them went to prairies. And of course the railroads also bought a different class of pole, for instance, for their telegraph poles along the railroad line than the power companies or the telephone, you know, BC Tel used. So then there were all sorts of other minor products. Cordwood was classed as a minor product. In the Kettle country, we had things called orchard props that went to the Okanagan, and they were just, you know, some of these jack pine stands were thicker than hair on a dog's back, and you go in and thin those things out. You get, you know, poles 10, 12 feet long, yay big around, that they used to prop up the limbs on the fruit trees when they were heavy with fruit. So there was, there were parts of the country where there were still old tie hacks that were making hewing ties. Well, they were, you know, ties hacked out in the bush with a broad axe, railroad ties. So they had a price too. And then, of course, later on, you got into shake blocks and that sort of thing, and that was quite a few years later. But again, it was using down cedar primarily, big old stuff that had toppled, and they split shakes out of them. Other than that, you know, that was about the extent of the minor products at most places. But in later years, of course, all that changed with the types of tenure that were issued.
Did you worry about sustained yield in the early days and attempt to control the cutting in that way?
No, because, like I say, all through this part of the country, clear-cut logging was not a problem. In the early days, of course, they didn't have the ability to get high up on the hills like we're getting now. They capability in road building and so on is much changed. The capability of logging trucks too, I guess, to even get around is much changed. The rubber-tired skidder came along later, and loading and skidding machines that you ended up with fewer men in the bush and a lot more volume being moved. So in the early days, no, we didn't really worry about selective logging. In fact, outside of the coast in the early days, there was little, if any, reforestation, artificial regeneration, planting done in the interior.
Elimination of rangers.
There may have been. I can't really remember that there were too many who talked very much about it. There were a number who retired, early. I guess there was probably, I don't remember because it didn't affect me. They probably had some sort of a buyout package where people were declared redundant, and some of them left with a pretty fair package. But those rangers who didn't become district managers, I guess there was the 2 op-soup positions in each district that probably gave them a chance to stay right where they were and fill those in. I think there was a fair amount of opposition in various places from it, but
there seems to be quite a difference between someone who had years of experience working for the Forest Service and went to ranger school and worked into the system that way, as opposed to someone who went to forestry school and became an RPF and came into the Forest Service.
Well, a lot of the earlier people in the Forest Service had some basic experience in logging. A lot of the people who've gone to university and come out as with RPF and so on haven't really had the opportunity to be exposed to a lot of things the way they should. Now, a lot of them went with industry. I think there's quite a difference in the philosophy of those who went with industry and those who came to government.
In what way?
Well, I think perhaps some of the people who are with industry are probably a little bit more in touch with some of the facts of life and a little less talking philosophical and theoretical things. I mean, you think you got to get your hands dirty once in a while before you find out how long the mud stays on them.
But was there a special duty to being a forest ranger?
A special duty?
That gave you care for the forest in a different way than industry would have.
Yeah, well, I guess because we were looking at it as a people's heritage sort of thing. You accept that when the crop is ripe, it has to be harvested, but it has to be harvested in a careful, thoughtful manner. And in my days as a ranger, of course, they all date back to when things were considerably more simple. Not only the big machines that they're using now and so on hadn't been developed at that time, so there were limitations. There were limitations basically on what you could harvest, primarily because of the machinery that was available. The roads that are being built now are monstrous compared to roads that were built in my day, because they've got machines that can build them. The early days, if you saw a D7 Cat belonging to a logging company in the bush, that was a big machine. Things like D8s were saved for highway construction. A lot of roads built with D6s now. You see some monstrous machines in the bush building road. And people drilling rock and blasting to get a road through. That didn't happen in the early days. These were all things that stopped the operation cold. So being a ranger in that particular time, you probably have a little bit different outlook than some of the people would have had who were in rangers' positions at the time of the Forest Service reorganization. But, you just didn't spend a lot of money on roads because you didn't have it. Now, some of the road building, I still have a feeling in some instances that the industry is overbuilding a lot of roads. I don't know whether it is or not, but that's just a gut feeling that I have. But maybe the kind of weights they're hauling with the types of vehicles they have now, maybe they have to build them that way. But of course, I don't really believe in the universal prescription of clear cut, regardless of what some of these RPFs say in their letters to the editor of the paper about nutrients and so on. My own feeling is that I just can't buy that as a universal prescription. I'm not going to say that there aren't some places where clear cutting is probably an essential, but to say that clear cutting and burning is the only route to go, I just don't believe it. And that's what we're getting from some of the RPFs and the industry and the paper. It makes it easy, but there are other alternatives that worked very well years gone by, and which again might work well if they really sat back and looked at them. But they're going to cost them $1 more, And right now it appears that everything is based on how fat you can make the wallet. That's my opinion, and I think that 20 years down the road we're going to suffer for it too. I have another theory too, of course, that somewhere along the line, I think to satisfy political needs, or whatever you want to call them, they've probably developed an overcapacity in their forest nursery, so they've got to find a place to put all this stuff. Best place to put it is in the clear cut. But I've seen an awful lot of plantations that have been total and absolute failures too. But I think it's kind of nuts, hard for me to believe that somebody can say you can clear cut and burn, and then when you're ready to plant, you got to come along with some pesticides and kill all the brush and weeds and stuff that have grown up on it. You see, you don't get that sort of situation with this fast weed growth, primarily because of the fast return of nutrients after the burn has happened. On some of these other areas, I'm not going to say you won't get brush, but you probably are not going to get it to the same extent. And then, again, my feeling is that after the clear cut and burn, you've got a fair amount of very soluble nutrients which are gone very rapidly. Whereas if you did some scarification or just bashed some of that stuff down into little chips and so on, still going to return nutrients to the soil. It's going to return them over a longer period of time, and 10 chances to 1. Even if you did go into areas like that and do some fill-in planting or whatever, you might get a better forest. I don't know. It's just got to have an idea, I guess, before anything happens. That's mine. Of course, there are those who say I wouldn't be qualified to pass that sort of judgment, but I'm still entitled to an opinion.
Well, if operations were so limited in logging in the 40s, and yet you were responsible for putting out forest fires in some fairly remote spots, did you ever wonder at the value of putting fires out in areas that where logging seemed quite remote?
Well, there were places where, of course, we the decision was made to let the fire go, and even as late as 1970s, I guess. We let fires go up the Duncan because, if all you had was manpower, and these people were, trying to build fire line by hand, and we had helicopters hauling stuff in there at a great old rate. And in fact, it used to keep one helicopter totally busy from the end of the Duncan River Forest Road. I think this fire was up around Hume Creek or something years ago. And, they just were not making any headway. The ground was tough, and somebody was going to get hurt seriously in there. And besides that, there were, we had a helicopter in there that could probably be put to better use